Good morning. My name is Jude Blanchette. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS, and I'm delighted everyone is joining us for this really important discussion with Bates Gill on his important new book, which is forthcoming from Oxford University Press, Daring to Struggle, China's Global Ambitions under Xi Jinping. Anyone who's been reading or thinking about China has encountered Bates's work, which for decades has been some of the most insightful in exploring how China's foreign and domestic politics are changing. And now he has written this important new book, which comes at a critical time for China as we look ahead to the 20th Party Congress. With Xi Jinping taking a third term, we have to wrestle with how much has changed for China and for China's position in the world over the last decade. And Bates's book is essential reading for thinking not only what has occurred, shifts, transformations over these past 10 years, but critically, this is a toolkit for helping us navigate the years ahead and for however long the Xi Jinping era continues. It's a special honor for me to be hosting this event because Bates was the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS from 2002 to 2007. And of course, when I first thought of or heard of the name of the Freeman Chair, it was when Bates held this. And so it is a distinct honor to be his successor. Hopefully I have carried the torch.
More than enough.
Thank you. So Bates is right now a professor of Asia-Pacific Security Studies and the head of the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University in Australia. We're here to sort of cover broadly the book and its really important insights and structure. As I said, the book will be published by Oxford University Press later. The date has shifted a bit, but hopefully early June is when the book will be on bookshelves. I've had a chance to read it in digital form. It's fantastic, and without any exaggeration, I think it is absolutely the best book we have to understand Xi Jinping's time in power. So with that, Bates, it's a real honor, and thank you for joining us.
It's an honor for me too, Jude. Thanks so much for having me.
Start with a simple question, which is, what was the motivation to write the book? I guess that's an obvious question, given how important China is and how important Xi Jinping is. But I'm curious, what was the point at which you said, I've got to start looking at this in more detail?
Well, you know, like a lot of things in writing books, you know, the original idea evolves, morphs, changes, and I think what really drew me to it was I was increasingly interested, but also increasingly concerned about the role that the party plays in life in China these days, and of course, in addition, not just in terms of domestic politics and the economy, but noting that it seemed to be increasingly involved, more active, having a bigger voice, a bigger mandate to pursue foreign policy activities as well. You know, and your work has noted the importance of the party and its impact on policy and on life in China these days. And I think we do have to link that to Xi Jinping. And we're coming to the 10th, 10 years that he's been in power. We know that he wants to continue on for another 5, 10, who knows how much longer. And so I thought it was an appropriate moment to try and look back on this last decade of power that he's been there, consider more deeply the role that he himself, or maybe more broadly, what he represents in terms of the party's involvement in China's foreign policy and the impact it's had. And then try to think through, well, if we can come up with a good framework for understanding that engagement of the party and its importance in China's foreign policy, what does that imply then? What are the implications of that going forward for the United States and for the world? So that's sort of what drove it. And the harder part was kind of coming up with a framework for how to take that enormous amount of information and complexity and distill it in a way that would hopefully make some sense for people.
And I want to ask you in a bit about that framework, but actually, if I could ask you a question I was curious about, the epigraph for the book. Where words fail, music speaks. Why?
Well, I'm in a band, and I've played in a band for probably 30 years or so. And very unfortunately, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've lost two of the best musicians in that band have passed away, and I dedicate the book to them, to J.P. Fisher and Chris Simpson. And I found this epigram, which I think, for me at least, said what I felt about them. That it's impossible to express in words how I feel about them, but playing music helps me to say what I want to say.
This should be a simple question, but I find it, for me, one of the hardest to answer. Oftentimes when I speak with friends, family members, relatives, they ask, what does China want?
Right.
And I think there are some I encounter who have a clear, easy answer for this, but I find that I do struggle in a self-convincing way to give a pithy answer to it. When you're asked this question, what does China want?
Right.
What's your answer? Well,
that's the opening line of the book, is a conversation that I had with a friend, one of the most privileged people in China, living in Shanghai, and I asked him that question, and the response didn't startle me, but it made me concerned, and maybe was a driving factor in wanting to get this book out. He said, we want to be accepted and respected, and you'd better get used to it. And so I think it's what does China want? Well, and especially let's talk about what the Chinese leadership wants. What does the Chinese Communist Party want? And I believe it is to be to be granted, or to be given, or to be allowed to receive legitimacy and respect, appreciation, even, I think, in their view, approbation for what they've achieved internationally, and they wish to be respected, and that's what they want. And to be respected isn't simply a normative concept. It means to have their interests respected, to have their claims to territory respected. It means to have their aspirations towards leadership, and even their aspirations to disseminate their own sort of way of looking at how the world should work, in terms of an acceptance of, especially of their form of governance domestically, to be accepted and respected. I think that's what China wants. It's amorphous. I'll grant you that, and it's not exactly a grand strategy. But nonetheless, it has enormous implications because that their pursuit of that respect and that pursuit of that legitimacy runs directly into the interests of not just the United States, but countries all around the world, and leads us, I think, to some increasing tension.
If we can imagine a counterfactual, which is, let's say, some point after the death of Mao, events occur in China which lead it to see a more fundamental transformation of its political system. Let's say it's something that's much more recognizably as a democracy. How much of what you just articulated in terms of what China wants would be consistent, and how much would differ? I put the question another way. How much of the story of this clash of interests between democracies, Western democracies, and China today is about the substance and very nature of the Communist Party as a political institution, and how it conceptualizes its interests and exercises power, and how much of it is a deeper script about respect and about China's proper place in the world? That's a question I wrestle with. The conversation here in DC, of course, positions it as this is about the Communist Party. But just in hearing you conceptualize what your friend in Shanghai said, I could imagine that same narrative and set of interests occurring under a democracy of 1.4 billion people.
Yeah, I think what's happened is that we've come, we've first been in this intensifying competition with China around economic matters, as China's become a more powerful economy. And, I think that was an acceptable kind of competition. We still talk about it in those sorts of terms, at least rhetorically, that we're prepared to engage, in that type of competition with China. And we're learning how to do that, and we're figuring out how that can be done. More recently, let's say in the last 10 or 15 years, that spectrum of competition has expanded to now more increasingly encompass, let's call it just military forms of competition, as we increasingly recognize that our ability to defend what we see as our Americans see as their interest, or what some of our allies and friends in the region see as their interest, is coming under pressure as China becomes a more powerful military. But I think there are ways of managing that competition as well. What I think distinguishes the Xi Jinping era is we now have opened a third phase, I would say, of competition. And it does, I think, arise from the more intensive importance and mandate and role that the party appears to be playing, and which it appears to want to extend in many respects beyond China's borders, to try and alter international thinking about what is and isn't a good form or bad form of governance, what is and isn't the right way that international norms should be developed and executed. So I think ideological competition is probably a little bit, maybe too strong of a word, because I think it implies too much about competition with the Soviet Union, the Cold War, or it implies that China wishes to impose its form of governance upon the rest of us. I don't think that's really accurate. But it is a new form of competition that we've never really experienced. Well, maybe you could go back to the days of Mao Zedong and so on, but of course in those days China was a much weaker, less prominent international player. So now you have this confluence of three major areas of competition at a time when China is the second world's largest economy by some measurements, much more powerful actor, and led by a party, not just one man, but by a party that is absolutely determined to compete on these grounds and to win.
Picking up on that last point you made of centering the party, it seems, especially discourse on China since the 19th Party Congress in 2017, we've really centered Xi Jinping as the prime mover of China's grand strategy, its missteps, many of its successes. Your subtitle of your book is China's Global Ambitions Under Xi Jinping. He's on the cover. When I was just hearing you describe, though, the nature of the competition, you were centering the party as a broader apparatus. If I can continue to ask counterfactuals.
Okay.
How much of our discussion today and the substance of your book would diverge if we had had 10 years ago a different outcome of the leadership transition? Put another way, is this Xi Jinping's party and we're all living in it?
Right.
Or is Xi Jinping leading a party where there is an elite consensus around the need for a much more aggressive, confrontational, forward-leading global posture?
Yeah, I'm more drawn to the latter interpretation, that he's received a mandate from the larger collective of party leadership to take on this more strongman role, to pursue this more proactive, assertive policies at home, to promote the party and its value from their perspective to China's success, and so on. But it's a mix. I mean, obviously, he was chosen for a reason, because of the kind of person he is. You couldn't just put anybody into that job to pursue that mandate as we're seeing it unfold. So I'm sure it's a combination of having a full mandate of the party consensus behind him, largely behind him, but in the knowledge that as an individual he is capable of taking on that mantle, taking the risks, right, wearing it, having the courage, honestly, to be in that job, and probably the right kind of ego and character to be able to achieve the mandate that I think the party, broadly speaking, wants China to achieve. So I guess it's primarily I would say it's a consensus. I think he's a consensus that's probably not a strong enough word. I think there's a very powerful degree of support behind him. But it couldn't be done by just anybody. I mean, I think he had the right mix, in their view, of pursuing what was necessary at that time. And I think he still largely has that kind of support behind him.
Towards the later end of the conversation, I want to circle back around to that, because I want to ask you how what seem to be mounting headwinds in China might be fracturing that consensus, and especially as the months leading up to the 20th Party Congress, there's open speculation about has Xi Jinping, gone too far, showed too many mistakes, and is this opening up avenues for challenges? But we'll come back to that later. Early on in the book, you write, a decade into Xi's leadership, and as he looks ahead to sustain his power and influence for at least another decade or more, China is better positioned than ever to realize its grand ambitions. I wanted to ask if you could unpack that a bit.
Sure.
Let's put aside for the moment these headwinds, because I think we can talk about the ways, and I'd like to ask you subsequently, have events over the last 3 to 6 months changed your underlying assessment? But let's just rewind to the day before China signed its joint statement with Russia, which many date as the beginning of a series of missteps. But let's go back to February 3rd. What has changed over the past decade, which you feel has given China this advantageous position, looking out over the broad sweep of 70 years of the PRC or 100 years of the Communist Party? Yeah. Why is it better positioned today to realize its objectives?
I would unpack it in two ways. One, what we have today is, China's more wealthy than it has ever been before. It's certainly more powerful economically, militarily, diplomatically than it's ever been. I mean, but some would say, well, that's a rather low bar. I mean, we look across the last 100 years of the history of the Communist Party. Nearly half of it, we could say half of that was chaos, was a mess. So the fact that they've emerged from that era, the earlier era, to where they are today, I think arguably it's pretty clear they're in a better place now than they've ever been to achieve what they. That doesn't mean they will. It just simply means that they have brought themselves to a place where they certainly could, if they play their cards right. The other reason I would make that statement, and how we can unpack it a bit, is you have this combination of capacity and will, and I think especially over the past 10 to 15 years, of increasing hard power, economically, militarily, especially, combined with this consensus that we just talked about of what appears to be, up until quite recently, strong party unity around Xi's leadership, his acceptance of the mantle, and his dogged pursuit of all of these things. So you combine capacity plus will. I don't think we could look to a previous era where there was that same combination for China as we see it today. So that's why I come out with saying, they're certainly in a better position than they've ever been before, but as we'll talk, that doesn't mean they're going to succeed.
I'd like to turn now to the framework, the structure for the book, how you explore the last 10 years. There's a number of ways you could have done this, and I wanted to ask, you end up arriving at thinking about six fundamental objectives. Right. Legitimacy, sovereignty, wealth, power, leadership, and ideas. Before I ask you about some of these specific buckets, I just want to ask at how you arrived at this being the framework you thought for you was most able to help you explain or explore how China has evolved.
Yeah, I mean, I was purposeful in thinking about the book that I wanted it to try to appeal to a wider audience, that it might be useful for people who are just getting into the field, maybe students. It might be useful for people who had never really studied China, but they're well-informed citizens of the world. Maybe they're having to get seconded to a new position, a new job, a new role in government or in business or somewhere, and they need to try to read something that's not going to be too overly academic, and give them a framework that's relatively easy to remember and can be applied, I think, usefully to trying to understand, how do you take all that complexity that's involved in Chinese foreign policy and its intersection with its domestic politics and make it easy to understand. So I said, okay, how can I, what can you come up with as a 5 or 6 point set of issues or topics or umbrellas under which you can collect all this? And so these are the 6 that I thought were important. I mean, in some ways, the framework isn't staggeringly new. I mean, others have also tried to, boil down the essence of China's foreign policy to a handful of key objectives. What I tried to do, though, in the book is, instead of sort of looking at them sort of individually or as standalone topics, there's a diagram in the book it's a Venn diagram, which tries to so graphically depict that while, for the purposes of a book, you have chapters across these 6 objectives, nevertheless, they are overlapping with one another. They are synergistically in operation with one another, and of course, in the form of the Venn diagram, at the center, where the other 5 objectives overlap, is the key objective that I think is so important for us to understand, and that's legitimacy of the party.
Why don't we start with that? There's a few words in discourse around China that I find, although we use it, if I scratch, I find that oftentimes we have different underlying conceptions. Legitimacy and ideology are 2 such terms where I think if you line up 10 people, you'll get 14 different particular descriptions of what they mean. Can you unpack legitimacy and how it relates to Chinese power and how it relates to the Communist Party? What, in your eyes, is legitimacy in the eyes of the Communist Party? And I'd like if you could just sketch out what shifts have you seen in how the party is conceptualizing and trying to grow or enforce its legitimacy vis-a-vis Chinese society?
Well, I think, again, I get back to this word acceptance and respect when I think about legitimacy. So I think the party is desperate, especially with its international relationships, to be seen as an acceptable form of governance, not only acceptable, but one that ought to be applauded in many respects because of the accomplishments that the party wants us to believe they've made, and maybe even going further, accepted and respected for what the party could achieve going forward, or even what lessons can be learned from the party's experience that could be applied internationally. And this is critically important. This is a Leninist party state that rules, well, at the end of the day, rules purely on its ability to convince the population that they deserve it. There's no elections. It's purely based on the belief of a relatively small portion of society. 7% of the Chinese population is Communist Party members. That they get to rule because they're better than anybody else and they know what they're doing. That's basically their claim to being legitimate rulers. As I speak in the book, there are several narratives that they try to promote. That only the Chinese Communist Party could have saved China from the disaster that it faced in the early part of the 20th century. Only the Chinese Communist Party could have put in place this economic miracle, sort of performance legitimacy. Only the Chinese Communist Party can be the rightful steward of China's cultural tradition. And increasingly under Xi Jinping, I think we hear more, although this has always been a part of the Marxist-Leninist tradition. But nevertheless, under Xi Jinping, you hear a lot more that only the Chinese Communist Party understands the tides of history in a way that will allow them to be at the vanguard and to lead China to its future rejuvenation. These are legitimacy narratives that are extremely important in order to convince 2 important audiences. One is the domestic audience in China, that because of these achievements and accomplishments and abilities, the population should continue to grant the mandate of leadership to the party, and not only just grant it, but be thankful and appreciative of it. And then I think it's also important for an international audience to convince the outside world that the party deserves to be where it is, and it ought to be granted the proper respect that it wishes to have. The problem is that many of these narratives, especially as they operate and are voiced and vocalized and executed internationally, disrupt and interfere with, and even, can oftentimes even attack the interests of other countries. So the more they pursue this legitimacy narrative, the more problematic it becomes in many of their relationships internationally.
You've got wealth as a separate bucket, but if I can, well, as you say, there's a Venn diagram, but you've got it as a distinct objective. I wanted to ask about legitimacy. We talk about, and you just mentioned that there are other elements of a legitimating narrative that the party is trying to put forward. Nationalism is one. They've been reworking some of China's near history to buttress the role of the Communist Party. Does the legitimacy of the party survive a dramatic and enduring slowdown in China's economic performance? Put another way, we've got various bells and whistles and knobs and dials on the legitimacy machine, but I wonder to what extent is economic growth and performance a master, the master volume?
Yeah.
And although you can tweak and turn the other ones, does the party survive? Does its legitimacy survive after 5 or 10 years of dramatic slowdown? In other words, as Bill Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
How much does that still weigh on the party?
I think it's still absolutely critical, and it has been a foundational element of the party's claim to legitimacy. I think it continues to be, but as we know, there are diminishing returns on that, and the ability for that aspect of the performance legitimacy narrative, can't be sustained for forever. Sometime this economy is going to slow down. It already is, and it's going to become more difficult for that element of their legitimacy narrative to work. But I think the party certainly knows that, and are looking to other ways of buttressing their legitimacy, including through economic measures. So I think it goes a long way to explaining why there's this attempt yet again to work to develop indigenous innovation, to become less dependent on external sources of capital, of technology, of know-how. We'll see where that goes, but I think it's an indicator that if this economic narrative is going to continue to work for them, they're going to have to figure out a way to get out of the middle income trap that they're in the moment, and continue to find new forms of productivity for the economy in order to maintain that economic narrative. But short of that, I think other legitimacy narratives have to come to the fore, and maybe their knobs start getting larger and more important. And I think nationalism is a very important one, obviously, and I think possibly even the sort of cultural stewardship narrative is also, I think, going to be a bigger and bigger thing for the party as the economic one meets headwinds and begins to falter.
I wanted to next move to ideas. Sixiang is the word you use in the book, the Chinese that you're drawing from. I wonder if you can talk about how what changes you've seen over the last decade. I'd like to also ask how much you see China as being able to translate its own preferred ideological construction and project that outwards. You said, I think you tipped your hat early on in the discussion saying you think it might be overblown, some of these ideas of exportability or China's ability to sort of push its preferred ideological constructions out into the world. But I wanted to ask if you could unpack that a bit.
Well, I have to say, this was the sort of one of the 6 elements that are at the center of the book. This is the one I really kind of wrestled with hardest. It is the most amorphous, I think, and it's probably the most. If we put those sort of 6 key elements of Chinese foreign policy on a timeline, I would say that the promotion of ideas or the attempts to promote China's own wisdom for the world is relatively recent. I mean, there are examples, under the Maoist era, I suppose, of when Maoism was promoted worldwide or was attempted. But it strikes me that this is somewhat different. And what I'm looking at, really, it circles back to legitimacy again. It's an effort to try and reshape global thinking about what is and isn't a proper form of governance, what is and isn't a proper approach to development in the world, and doing so mostly through international organizations like the United Nations, but also through fora which China has created and fostered and promoted, such as the Forum for Cooperation with Africa, or with the Arab League, and other sort of China-focused, China-centered multilateral organizations where it's an opportunity to promote their vision about how the world should work, in their view more equitable, but I think at core more accepting, more willing to respect and legitimate their form of governance. And when you write a book, you have to stop writing at some point and hand it over to the publisher. So the book came out before the famous February 3rd statement between China. What I mean to say is I had handed over the manuscript before that.
Right before it got interesting.
But I think that it looked no further, really, than that statement as a sort of summation of many of these ideas,
right,
which China is trying to promote internationally about how the world should work.
I wanted to ask you about the question of leadership. I remember when then President Obama, chided China as essentially shirking its international responsibilities and being a free rider. Under the same Obama administration, when China unveiled the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, there was pretty vociferous pushback against that. And I still hear today AIIB used as an example of where China clashes with our interests. It's an example of China trying to build parallel orders. I wanted to ask just on that question of where is the legitimate space for China to lead, and in what precise form are we comfortable with? I can understand some of China's frustration with what seems to be a ping-pong sort of narrative of the U.S. in particular, how we welcome China to be an active presence in the international order, but when we see it take leadership positions in established multilateral institutions, when we see it create something like the AIIB, which is not a radical Maoist organization hell-bent on fomenting revolution, but is I think putting it in a positive spin is helping to fill a gap of infrastructure spending in areas that need it. How do you think about that question, and where do you think the space is for China to be a leader in the international order that would be acceptable to established powers?
Well, the answer to that question is probably very few places, because those established powers fear, new kid on the block with different ideas and trying to change the system. And also, I think it's important for us to be honest with ourselves in the West, that a part of this concern, I think, has to arise from the fact that we ourselves, in our own domestic political systems, in many of the institutions that we are deeply involved with and have invested in, we're failing. Yeah. Or we're having a lot of trouble, let's put it that way. So you have this combination of, again, will and capacity on China's side to pursue leadership roles, and real resources, serious resources to devote to trying to fix some of the world problems, at the same time that we ourselves are, flailing a bit in trying to generate our own good ideas and sort of reassert our leadership. So that I think that explains a lot of the fear that we have, and I think would underscore then why, when there is this ping pong narrative, that when China does seem to want to put its hand up and do something, there's a lot of concern on our part. I mean, I think all that said, China itself, I think, remains comparatively reluctant to really step forward and do a lot in ways that it probably could. And it seems that it's largely interested to do so in two major ways. One, to try and reform and, in their view, improve multilateral governance institutions, especially within the UN system. And secondly, to just unilaterally pursue leadership, especially in emerging forms of technology, to try and dominate and corner many of the emerging technological realms in ways that they can assert their leadership in those ways as well. So in both cases, I think it raises a lot of alarm bells in places like Washington, and as we see, there's a lot of pushback against China in its efforts to do so.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. There is a lack of consistency in where, when, and how China does or does not take a leadership stance. You know, two recent examples are earlier on after COVID emerged, from China and spread globally, when China was in a fairly good position about containing the spread of the virus domestically, while the United States and other democracies were not, to put it lightly. It seemed at the time there was a worry that China was really going to sort of push on an open door and assert leadership in the public health sphere globally, and I never saw that happen. And the second is, after Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a month or so where there was this hope or expectation that China was going to step up and play some sort of mediating role.
Right.
Now, probably both of those were more aspirational than they were accurate reflections of where China's political system was at the time. But it is interesting, speaking of, which you talk about at depth in the book, sort of strategic windows of opportunity where China could really be asserting its interest. There is a deep reluctance. What's interesting now is with Xi Jinping, I've also noticed the same attribute. When things get really tough domestically in China, that's when he usually puts someone else out in the front. Early on in COVID, it was Sun Chunlan on the Politburo. She was the one who was sent down to Wuhan. Li Keqiang was sent down to Wuhan. Right now, there's this round of speculation that Li Keqiang is surging ahead because the economy is doing sort of lackluster performance. Another interpretation is this is very Xi Jinping, and as the economy is facing headwinds, he's moving, another fall guy out. Liu He was responsible for trade relations with the United States rather than, Xi Jinping was very absent from that entire discussion. So it seems he has a conservatism too about being too vocal and out front when there is uncertainty in outcome. And I wonder if the same, if we could scale that up to the Communist Party more generally, where there are safe opportunities, for example, staffing key UN bodies where the United States is AWOL. That's a leadership China is willing to show.
And I think one thing China has a lot of, and that is cash. And they are doing a lot within the UN system in funding initiatives, providing support, for example, for the Secretary General's Peace and Development Fund is mostly PRC money. Right. And PRC individuals get to choose, how that money gets spent within the UN system. So they're lower key, and it's actually not. It's very much like you're suggesting, I think, and it's not. I think it's characteristic, not just of Xi Jinping's leadership, but I think we can go back to other Chinese leaders of attempting something, testing waters, seeing what might work, see what doesn't get too much pushback, and do it in a more quiet way. and then scaling it up.
It's the Lenin quote, which I will butcher, but it's something to the effect of, probe with your bayonet. If it's mush, continue forward. If it's steel, you retreat.
That's it.
Cognizant of the time, what I want to do is I want to turn to some of the questions that have come in from the audience, and then I want to end circling back to the book, and I want to ask you about some of the headwinds and how those how those might shape the trajectories you've written about in the book. Let me start with one close to your current home out in Australia, and that is on the Solomon Islands. I wanted to ask for your assessment of how big of a move was this by China. Does this fundamentally affect the security architecture in your region? And also, was this a failure by Australia or the United States?
Well, I think it's a big deal. I mean, I think it's important. I don't see it as important necessarily quite yet as some sort of fundamental alteration of the strategic balance in the region. I think that it's way too early to know if that's what this really is going to end up portending. But what I find interesting as a China watcher is that this is a pretty bold move for China to do, because they would surely know what the response is going to be in the region. They've tended to be relatively reluctant about sending their own, unilaterally sending their own, law enforcement authorities over the borders into other countries. It's a relatively rare thing. Typically, it's done, under the auspices of the United Nations or something like that. So, I think it's a pretty bold move on China's part. Remains to be seen exactly what this agreement's going to entail and how much is it really going to matter at the end of the day. But it's a testing of the waters. It really is. And probably Beijing felt it was relatively small offer of resistance. Could it turn into something bigger? Probably could. But will it? We don't know yet. I think a lot's going to depend on let's not forget the Solomon Islands have enormous agency here, as do other countries in the region that might want to try to either put up a better offer or try to deflect what China's up to. There's no doubt that a country, the size and location of the Solomon Islands is not going to gain a whole lot of attention from the United States. And even though it may be in Australia's backyard, so to speak, that's how the Australians often phrase it, so too there, probably not getting the kinds of attention and appreciation that leaders in the Solomon Islands would prefer. So there's a lot of baggage in Australia's relationships with its neighbors, especially in the Pacific Island region, that has not been fully cleared up and made improvements. So yeah, I think there's a fair bit of failure on our part for not trying to engage these countries like that more effectively.
Question returning to the legitimacy goal. Does China's position as defender of the realm in the face of a perceived global encirclement campaign, how does this bolster their claims to legitimacy domestically? In other words, as strategic competition with the United States, Australia, UK, Japan, the list is growing, becomes more real and palpable, will the party be able to translate that, or jujitsu, I forget which one, into a stronger value proposition of the party is here to protect China from this global encirclement?
Well, I think they're already doing it, and this has been a fundamental element of the party's claim to legitimacy for a long, long time. And this is what scholars in the field call the narrative of aggrieved nationalism, right? That the world is out to get us, and only the party is in a position to protect China from those depredations. Now, typically, that kind of narrative always links back to, invasion by Japan, colonialism by the British, American interventions around China's periphery, and it usually links back to that history and then tries to suggest that, well, if it weren't for the party, China would be all carved up now. So it's nothing new for Chinese Communist Party to talk about encirclement, containment, hegemony, and how it alone can protect the Chinese people, the Chinese heritage now, Chinese cultural tradition from those depredations. But I think the implied message in the question is correct, and that is that it is likely to be, for the party, an even more and more important element of its legitimacy narrative. And I think we can see that today, just taking the Ukraine example. The second or third sentence out of any official statement these days about what the situation in Ukraine is, well, don't forget NATO in Belgrade. Don't forget the bombing of our embassy and the spilled blood of Chinese martyrs in our embassy in Belgrade, thanks to NATO. So this has not gone away. It's always been an element of the party's effort to bolster its position domestically. And, as I think Henry Kissinger once said, even paranoids have real enemies. So it's going to remain something for China or the party to promote as the relationship with many key actors internationally becomes more and more contested.
I want to end thinking through some of the headwinds and how what seem to be, at least for the moment, a growing pile of missteps, own goals, but also structural changes to the international order that augur a much more complicated external environment. In our stripped down bumper stickers story of China over the past several decades, pragmatism, flexibility that the party has shown as it moved out of a planned economy, underneath that, and oftentimes insufficiently articulated, I think, is just a very hospitable international order, right? For Chinese outbound investment, for firms coming into China, very permissive environment in which China could hide and bide by essentially self-strengthening, aggregating, building wealth, building up its economy, borrowing, begging and stealing foreign technology, which it can then incorporate into its own domestic innovation ecosystem and supply chains. A number of things seem to be changing now, and the ground is just moving underneath China's feet, again, through a combination of what are clearly pathologies within the political system being accentuated by Xi Jinping, but also just a much more scrutiny and outright hostility towards China in the international environment. The low-hanging fruit of China's economic growth, productivity gains have been plucked. Yep. One of the reasons Xi Jinping is pushing so hard on indigenous innovation and investments into high tech is to find new productivity gains. Yep. I am tempted to look at all of this and feel like there is the slope of China's ascent has decreased by some not insignificant magnitude, because it's hard to see how the ship is rerighted, because this isn't just domestic politics gone awry, it's structural factors in terms of China's operating environment globally. Yep. How do you think about this? Are we seeing the beginning of a fundamentally new chapter to the next decade or so of China's development that is much more contested and difficult? Are we now doing what we often do, where we look at temporary hiccups, extrapolate into regime collapse, and then are proven wrong again? Have we
reached peak Xi?
Have we reached peak?
And I mean, I think as I've completed the book, and I think there is a logical arc, I'd like to believe, because the book starts with a chapter called Opportunity, and it sort of tries to explain, where was China in 2012, 2010, 2012, as he was being groomed for power and as he assumed leadership. And I think at the time, I think they saw enormous opportunity ahead, and an opportunity to devote those burgeoning resources and a reunified will, as personified by this guy, Xi Jinping, to grab those opportunities and achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But by the end of the book, 10 years later now, here in 2022, the book's concluding chapter is challenges. And it's the very pursuit of those 6 objectives, as I've framed them, it's the very pursuit of them, which are maybe not largely responsible for, but substantially responsible for the very pushback and headwinds that they're facing across all 6 of them. And so it's a fundamental dilemma that now that you've staked your claim to these 6 important objectives and you've put in place a process by which to promote them and which the party believes is the correct pathway to achieving them, how do you walk back from that? Yeah. How do you readjust? How do you rethink or admit failure and try to take a different direction? The way I conclude in the book is that that's not going to happen. I just don't believe that under the current leadership in China, which I think we have to presume, love to hear your thoughts on this, I think we have to presume is going to be Xi Jinping, at least for the foreseeable future, next 5 years or so. I do not see him and the current leadership of the Chinese Communist Party as in any mood to back down, or at least not to do so substantially. And that's why I think we're going to be entering into this much, much more contested era, because I don't think they have a good plan for how to readjust quite against the headwinds that they're facing across all 6 of the key objectives that I lay out.
I know you've got a flight to catch, so we're going to leave it on that depressing note, but hopefully also that has piqued the interest of viewers that if they want to hear more of this analysis, they've got to go spend the $29
cheaper on digital.
Cheaper on digital to buy the book, Daring to Struggle. Again, it's just I think an essential guide to understanding the past decade, and also, as you were just describing, to understanding what's coming next. So Bates, it was a real pleasure, and I look forward to the second edition of this in 10 years or so, when we've where we've
maybe we're post Xi.
Yeah. When Xi is entering is just mid stride to the 400 years he's planning on ruling China. So anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Jude.
Great, thank you, and thank you to everyone.